Let's start with just a brief introduction of ourselves. My name is Nick. I'm running the malware intel team at Intel 471. Jorge, myself, and the rest of the guys, we spend all day looking at malware, mostly financially motivated malware, and we're trying to figure out what these guys are doing. We're trying to track their actions in a programmatic way and then analyze the data that we collect.
So, as Nick said, I work as a malware analyst in his team. This is my first time speaking at B-Sides, so let's go for it. And if you want to talk shop, you can reach me through Twitter 24 hours per day.
So a little overview of how we've structured the talk. So the beginning is answering the question, what is QBot? And I'm glad we put that because it seems like nobody knows what it is. Second, we'll talk about how does QBot work. That's the technical portion. Trying to keep it to like high-level tactics and procedures and tools used and function of the malware. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit more about the vendors that the QBot operators use because they don't do everything themselves. They outsource some of the work to others. So let's get started. QBot is a modular info stealer. So the main purpose of QBot is to gather information from the infected machine. The modular part means that they can load additional plugins for additional functionality. So if, for example, they want to turn your machine into a proxy, they just load a UPnP plugin, and now your infected machine is a proxy. Or they can load a cookie grabber plugin that steals all the cookies that are saved by all your browsers and ships those back to the back end. QBot first emerged in 2007, according to a report released by Symantec. It's a really good report, in fact, so we trust that this is true. But it hasn't always been showing the same level of activity over the years. So some years we've seen low levels of activity, but some years we've seen, like right now, high activity where the operation is going at full strength. We will be talking about activity from the year 2019, unless we specify otherwise. So everything that we talk about, like how the malware is spread and stuff like that, is relevant to 2019. QBot is financially motivated. It's not an APT, but I would classify it as an advanced threat, and it can also be persistent. But it's not APT in the sense of espionage. It's financially motivated. They're trying to make money using their QBot malware. The current code base actually matches the analysis done in 2011. And what that seems to show is that we're talking about the same malware that was operating in 2011, which is actually quite impressive because not many malware families have that long of a lifespan. And it's still actively developed to this day. So just a few months ago, we saw a new plugin that was released, and we've also seen new functions that were developed as we're tracking this threat. So why QBot? Why are we calling it QBot? Again, sorry for the small screenshot, but this is some of the strings that were found in the binary, and I'll read some of them out for you. QBot version, QBot configuration path, QBot run mutex. The authors are calling it QBot, and that's why we're calling it QBot. Now, some vendors have given other names like QuakeBot and PinkSlipBot, but we're going to stick with QBot because that's what the authors call it. I'd like to give a shout out to some of the previous work that's been done. Give credit where it's due. We've read over these reports here. They're all excellent. It's all really good work done that we've built upon. And to improve our own understanding of the malware as well. And to validate like things that were seen in 2011, can we see that it's the same now? Again, it shows that it's one actor group consistently operating over time. So now we know what is QBot. Let's talk about how does QBot get onto your network, onto victim machines. So in 2019 and even 2018, we've seen the primary delivery mechanism is mal spam. So malicious spam either with a link to some other file or with files attached. So sometimes we see JavaScript loaders, we see VBS loaders, we see documents like Office documents with macros, the prevailing theme here is that the QBot operators are continuously making modifications and changes to be able to bypass protection systems, to be able to bypass those protection systems to get onto the machine. An interesting note is that we've seen the same VBS loader used to drop other malware families such as Danabot, Drydex, and Hanseator, which seems to indicate that the QBot operators have purchased a dropper service or purchased a tool from someone else that other people are also using. So again, it shows that QBot operators will gladly outsource some of the work. One other thing that we've seen is QBot dropped by Emotet. Maybe some people have heard of Emotet. Yeah, few more hands. This family is really prevalent these days. It's one of the most talked about droppers, and they send new campaigns, spreading campaigns almost every day of the week and almost all over the world. I mean, all the way to like China, Latin America, Europe, United States. Emotet is considered top tier cyber criminals. And we saw Emotet dropping QBot earlier this year. And this shows that the QBot operators have access to top tier cyber criminals that maybe some of the lower ranking cyber criminals don't have access to. And that makes sense considering how long they've been in the game. So we've talked about what is QBot, how does it get to your machine. I'm going to talk briefly about what happens the moment that the QBot is launched on the machine, and then I'm going to pass it over to Jorge to jump into the details. So QBot launches itself several times to get everything accomplished that it wants to do. In the initial execution, can't see here, but it launches itself with a special flag, and then it creates a scheduled task to run itself again. And this is sort of a privilege escalation to get higher privileges. It's kind of ridiculous that Windows allows you to do that. But finally, we see that QBot runs itself from the scheduled task and injects its own copy of the core DLL into Explorer.exe. So you won't see some suspicious process name in your task manager. It's running inside Explorer.exe, which is presumably running on everyone's Windows machine. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Jorge.
So now that we have an overview into the QBot threat, let's go to dive into the internals. Well, first of all, we have to mention when we fetch binaries through MySpam or through Emotet or through any mean, this sample is packed under a custom packer. They seem to use always the same one, but it's polymorphic, so perhaps it works against antivirus detection. After performing an unpacking, we have another layer of protection which thwarts static analysis, and these are just two enclosed templates which are pretty straightforward to decode. There are plain SOR algorithms with 64 kbytes, but this simple procedure throws a lot of light into static analysis. I think you cannot see from there, but here we have all the code strings like API calls or the bookend messages, DLLs to load, and so on. So after we have the strings, the code, we can jump into the anti-virtualization, which QBot does a lot. It wants to ensure it's not running on a sandbox or a virtualized environment. For detecting them, he's going to use the IAN instructions from the Intel instruction set to detect VMware. It also will check if the sample has been renamed as sample.exe of artifact.exe. So perhaps there are some sandboxes using this procedure for submitted samples. And if QBot detects it's running on a virtualized environment, it will override the executable with the legitimate Windows calculator.
sort of erases itself.
So we have been discussing the protections from the unpacked sample. This is the QBot loader. And this loader has many resources, which are the next components in the effecting chain. They have IDs. We are interested in the first three ones. So for ID number 1, we have the core DLL, which is going to be injected into explore.exe. All of these resources are protected under two layers, one encryption layer or RC4, and another compression layer of brief LZ, which is hard to realize because it has the header changed into a custom one. So if you have an unknown compression algorithm with an unknown header, if you don't realize what are we dealing with, the only thing you have to do next is to implement yourself, which is a lot of work, and you want to avoid that at any cost. For IDs 2 and 3, those are the DLLs to be injected in Internet Explorer to perform the banking stealing. We have DLLs here targeting both architectures, 32 and 64 systems. And also the core DLL, which is the one responsible for establishing communications with the command and control, executing commands, has its own resources. They are listed in this table, and we are going to dive into every one of them in upcoming slides. Just to summarizing, the ID 8 stands for the onboard configuration. Number 10 is a JavaScript updater. QBot has two methods of fetching updated binaries. This is one of them. We are going to talk about the other one later. And the ID 11 stands for the controller list to establish this communication with the backend. For these resources, we have only one layer of protection for onboard configuration and controller list. This is only the encryption layer, RC4. And for the JavaScript updater, we have also the compression layer. The controller list and the onboard configuration are not really huge files. So when the thing gets bigger, I guess QBot operators want to make the executables tinier, so they compress these files. So for the onboard configuration, we have up to these two different kinds of internal configurations. For the first one, we have here the campaign ID and a configuration timestamp. For the campaign ID, let's say you run multiple malspam campaigns, or you have malspam campaigns and other malware installing third-party payloads. So on the backend, you can keep track of where does it come every bot. The configuration timestamp, we believe, is a timestamp the operators set in the samples for keeping track of when did they build them. And here is when the thing gets interesting. Those are compromised FTP locations, very likely stolen in previous QBot campaigns. So they used these compromised FTP accounts to upload the stolen data. These are legitimate addresses. So if they run one campaign and steal this FTP access to a user, in upcoming campaigns, they are going to upload the stolen information to this compromised FTP account. Finally, there are some samples which don't have the campaign ID. For example, this one. And this is because this is more likely to be an update for QBot. So the campaign ID is going to be inherited from the previous sample. For the JavaScript updater, it's pretty straightforward. It has some obfuscation, but very little. It will establish a communication with up to 3 controllers to essentially fetch an updated QBot. The communication has 2 layers of encoding and encryption. This is just hexadecimal encoding, and after that we will have RC4 encryption. Finally, after these 2 layers, we will have the final QBot executable. But before dropping it to disk, the JavaScript file is going to try some evasion for antivirus software, and for doing so, it's going to slide the fetched payload into 2. First, 1000 bytes on one side, and the very rest on another one. This is basically taking the P header from the executable file off from the rest of the file. So I believe this second file, even if it is a PE, an antivirus software perhaps cannot analyze it properly. So unsure if this works. For the last component in the resources for the core DLL, we have the controller list, which may have up to 150 controllers per sample, which is a lot. And we can see here controllers will listen in many ports, like 443 or 80, 90, 995. So for finalizing these internals of QBot, we list here the exported command, because after establishing communications with the IP controllers we just saw here, the backend is going to request the bots to execute some commands, and those commands are listed here. For the sake of simplicity, we only have renamed the most used one for the backend, and that is fetching QBot updates. This is the second method for fetching outdated QBots. Fetch web injects and fetch plugins. Also, it has lateral movement capabilities, which we are going to discuss later. By the way, the QBot version is also in this data section of the PE. Here we have the 3.2.2 version, and here the 3.2.3. They are different in terms, this one exports more commands. They are always adding new commands or removing existing ones. So, now that we have an overview into the technical internals of the thread, let's try to talk a bit more about the operation. So we started tracking QBot in May 2019, and we have collected all these versions. So we can tell you, these guys do code and do like coding and add new features. Many of the versions only show minor updates, but for other ones we have seen new commands, remove commands, and also new methods for data filtration. The campaign IDs we were discussing before in the onboard config, they will allow the operators of the partner to keep track of the infection, the source of these infections. For campaigns, SP and SPX, they are for sure delivered through malspam. The malspam waves Nick was describing. And for the HHH campaigns, those are from Emotet. The EU here, I believe it stands for Europe, because this wave was just targeting Europe, so you have another IP address, you won't get this QBot sample. Nowadays, there are ongoing QBot campaigns under SPX campaign ID, and these are incrementing numbers. For example, I think the last one was SPX 26 campaign ID. So, we said we have up to 150 controllers per sample, and as we have been tracking this thread since May, we have up to 3,000 unique controllers from QBot, which we have plotted in this geo distribution scheme. I don't know if we have told you this already, but QBot is targeting mainly the US and Canada. So it makes sense for all the controllers to be located in the United States. It will arise less suspicions if you see ongoing connections to the US from the US. So if you see some connections for Russia or for China, maybe you can flag the traffic as suspicious.
Yeah, another point is that the first line of QBot controllers are actually just proxies. And these proxies are made up of infected bots. So they have basically an endless supply of front-end proxies. And that's why we're seeing the front-end proxies located in countries where they focus most of their attention. It's really nice because it hides the back-end from prying eyes like us and law enforcement as well. And it's free to them. They're just reusing resources that they already have.
So we introduce QBot as a modular information stealer. This means QBot can extend its functionality with additional plugins. So far, we have seen these three here. The password grabber has been here since the very beginning of the operation. It will fetch credentials from services like POP3, also FTP to use later in the exfiltration procedures for the stolen data. One really interesting fact about the cookie grabber module. First time we saw this one was in August 2019. And it turns out that TripBot group released a cookie module in July 2019. So TripBot releasing a cookie grabber module in July, and then QBot in August makes us think that there is some kind of relationship between the groups, like, hey guys, we have released this module and it's working, it's useful, or perhaps they just saw it and they thought to themselves, perhaps we could code another one for us. We don't know. The last module we want to discuss here is the plug and play module, which will make these infected computers part of QBot infrastructure. So we have infected system, new infected system, already infected system acting as proxies, intermediate nodes, and the final QBot backend hidden with all of these intermediate infra, which is very clever actually. So you increase the uptime from the React controllers, so you don't have to reinstall in another servers. So let's go now. Let's move into the stolen data. QBot uses these templates for uploading the data they stole from infected users. The fields from the template are highlighted in red. They are self-explanatory: time, URL, data, the referrer. They seem to have a bug with Windows 10 Edge browser, as we see here, this bug tag. Well, the field T is not very self-explanatory, but it stands for type. So H2 will be data gathered through hooking HTTP or HTTPS requests.
So every HTTPS site that's visited by the infected user, all the cookies and the site itself are sent back to the QBot operators. So they can see if you're visiting interesting sites like banking websites, that will draw their attention towards you. This is how they find the interesting victims from the thousands of bots that they have.
There is also another type, which is denoted by KB, which stands for keyboard. So this keylogging technique will take keystrokes from P program, T Windows title. So for this case, they are keylogging in Chrome, in a keylogging Google Chrome window, and this should be the data gathered through the keystrokes. For this slide, we have some poetic justice, because if you check the kind of report here, it's also keyboard, so this data is collected through keylogin, and we have this, I have an important message for you. This starts interesting. About my late client, blah, 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 which has a deposit of $10.5 million. So if you want more information, I can give you full details at decifrank@usa.com. Same on this guy. He's a scammer, 419 scammer, and he's infected with QBot. For the lateral movement, which we have to discuss nowadays because this is like the trendy topic now, networks being infected by malware like TrickBot, Emotet, Dridex, QBot, they perform this protection, and after that, they run from the network. QBot has lateral movement capabilities. It's the command 13. It has to be issued from the backend to be executed. And it will take advantage of the NetBIOS protocol to spread through the internal network. To do so, it will try to use the administrator account, and in case it has a password, QBot has in one of the decoded templates this password listing to use against the administrator account. It's going to brute force his way into another shares to be executed in them. Also, it has the capability to execute this PowerShell command, which will fetch a PowerShell script from a remote location. In this case, is Dropbox, but could be another one. This PowerShell will have two DLLs within the code, and those are Mimikatz DLLs, which it could use to try further the administration account brute force, or just to report to the command and controls the passwords fetched through Mimikatz. There are claims by some vendors that QBot may be behind some post-intrusion ransomware outbreak. It is not confirmed, and we don't even confirm it or deny it, but it's just a chance you are exposed if you have a QBot infection in your network. So now that we have some overview into QBot internals at the operation, Nick is going to walk us through the vendor footprint.
So what am I talking about with vendor footprint? The QBot operators have done a really good job to stay under the radar. We don't know who they are. We don't know what their handles are. However, we do realize that they extensively use services of vendors in the underground economy. And by investigating those vendors, we can see who has connections to the QBot operators and what vendors they're using. So that's what we're going to talk about next. And this is something that I'm calling the vendor footprint of QBot. One of the services that they use is code signing. Code signing is used by legitimate software vendors to ensure that the software that they release to their users has not been tampered with. So they get a secure key from a company like Komodo or Symantec. Then they sign their binaries with this key, and then they release these signed binaries. And the reason why malware authors are interested in code signing is because it can help to bypass protection features of Windows like Smart Screen, which it will generally increase the chance that when an end user, when a victim clicks on the malware or executes the malware in some way, that this malware will be allowed to execute on the victim machine. So the QBot operators have used code signing into 2019 and previously before. but they don't do it for everything. So they don't use code signing on updates, but only for the mouse spam campaigns that they're trying to spread. In our tracking, we noticed that, okay, you can't really see it so well, but in about June, we saw a lot of code-signed QBot binaries. But then later on, we saw none. And these two are kind of anomalous. These are actually older versions that we just hadn't seen before. And then we picked them up later in our sample collection and processed them. So we're seeing them stop using this tactic. In the early days of QBot, a semantic report from 2011 suggested that QBot operators were stealing the signing keys from their victims and using them. But we think that in 2019, QBot operators are not doing this anymore. We think it's more likely that they're using vendors in the underground economy. And this is a post from an actor in an online forum saying, I'd like to offer you this service for $300. I will sign your malware, and it will look legitimate. And you can see that from the screenshots previously. This says, it says it cannot be verified because these certificates were revoked, but at the time that they were spread, these were valid, and Windows thought that they were valid. Another thing that makes us think that they stopped using stolen keys from their victims and switched to a vendor is because all of the code sign samples that we found were these keys were issued to companies in the UK, every single one. And if they were using keys stolen from bots, we should see a wider geographic distribution. And because we don't see that, it's another indication that they're using one of these online code signing vendors from the underground. Next, I'm going to talk about web injects. I feel like I might need to explain what a web inject is, so I'll do so briefly. When you go to a website, when you're infected with QBot and you go to a website in your browser that interests them, like a banking website or Amazon or something like that, what they can do is your browser will request the page, and Amazon, if that's the page, will send a response. And before the browser renders that response, they will inject some additional HTML and JavaScript to do things like add additional fields, like what's the mother's maiden name, what's your secret question. They'll try to also trick you into giving like an authentication token that they can then use to make a transaction, like a bank transfer. And we see the QBot operators using several different vendors for web injects. Web injects are actually not the most simple thing to develop and maintain. You have to have access to the bank's website. You have to spend a lot of time learning how the bank website works. And it's something that a lot of banking Trojans outsource. And QBot, interestingly enough, has outsourced to at least 3 different vendors, possibly more. Their web injects for QBot are mostly targeting the banking sector, financial services, online payments, online shopping. Interestingly enough, they're targeting Verizon, which is a telecommunications company, a cell phone company in the United States, mostly in the United States and Canada, but this can change at any time. Or it could be that we didn't detect the campaign that targeted other regions. So this is sort of what part of a web inject looks like. It's just JavaScript. This one in particular is ATS engine by an actor called Yumba. Yumba has been around since the early Zeus days. They're probably the oldest web inject vendor that I know of. And they offer their services for, here you can see $3,500 for Chase Bank. And that is a complete solution that requires no interaction from the operator. It's the ATS, automatic transfer system. In the case of QBot, they're targeting eBay, PayPal, and Amazon with this web inject kit. I want to also make a note about this gate key here. this is the default gate key that is when you buy ATS Engine. That's the default gate key that you're given when you set up that software. And I've seen previous researchers say, "Oh, I've seen this key used by 3 or 4 different banking Trojans. There must be some sort of link there." But I think a link would be very weak, given that this is the default key, and anyone who purchases the ATS Engine and doesn't change the default settings would have that gate key. Now, if that gate key were changed, then that would be an indication that there could be a link. The next one was first mentioned by a former colleague of mine, James Wyke, at BotConf, in an excellent talk that he gave about web injects. We don't know still who is behind this web inject pack, but it's denoted. It's been named ing_ing because of variable names that were assigned that you'll find in it. It's heavily obfuscated. Here's some of the less obfuscated code. There's some keywords in here like adminka path that you might be able to recognize if you see this in the wild. And this is what the panel, the login panel, looks like for the operator. The third vendor that we know is their services are purchased by the QBot operator is Cactus 1010. Cactus 1010 has a nice service. There's their website where you can buy, you can shop for web injects by brand, by country. It's on Tor. It's an Onion server. This is a screenshot of the panel, what it looks like to the operator. We have this because Cactus provided sample videos on their website. And this is what the login panel looks like if anyone is following along and investigating web injects. This is how you can tell that you're looking at uPanel. And uPanel stands for Universal Panel, which means you purchase this service and all your web inject needs are met. It can grab tokens. It can do automatic transfers. It's a very capable, and it seems to be pretty popular as well. And QBot specifically is using it to target American Express, Verizon, and Costco. I have a little bit of time left, so I'd like to talk about 2 web injects sets, packs that we found where we don't know who the vendor is. In fact, we don't really know anything about it at all. And as far as I know, I couldn't find any references to it in open source intelligence. I'm calling it Buka, simply because they use the name Buka a lot. I grepped through the file and found the Buka button, Buka timer, Buka main, Buka pop-up. So if anyone is looking at web injects and they've seen this Buka stuff, I'd like to talk with you. QBot is using it, this vendor, to target United States banks in the United States. It's also heavily obfuscated. This is some of the less obfuscated stuff that might be recognizable to someone. And then finally, I'll talk about Cortez. Cortez is less sophisticated than the other web injects. It doesn't use any obfuscation at all. Everything is completely in clear text. Personally, it looks to me like someone's first foray into web injects. Like they're just learning, and in fact, for QBot, they only use it to target a single bank. It could be that other vendors weren't working well with that bank, and maybe they tried their own hand at something that they weren't familiar with, or they outsourced the work to someone who wasn't as experienced as the other vendors. The reason why I called it Cortez is simply because the gate path is called Cortez.php. There really wasn't anything else that was unique about it. So for QBot, we are able to learn that they have an extensive operation where they use open source tools. They use their own developed tools. They use a Trojan that they've been using for 10 years almost. They continuously develop it, but they're not afraid to use vendors for spreading the malware, for doing web injects, and also for bypassing security solutions, the code signing. It's the mark, in my opinion, of a sophisticated group. If anybody wants to play along at home with the samples, we've got some hashes for you. It's kind of pointless to give IOCs of the controllers because they change so often. Although I did give the latest domain. Actually, it's not the latest domain. It changed. This is one domain that they were using for almost a year for fetching web injects. That's where they were hosting it, behind this domain. It's now cdnmetrics.com. Finally, someone took it down or something. I'd like to wrap up with just a few words about QBot. Personally, I would consider it a high priority threat, just given the amount of experience that they have and the fact that if you see this on your network, they're either going to make money off of your computers by making account transfers, or they can decide to ransom your data, and they have the tools to do full ransom of all machines in the network. And it's also not a threat that will be likely to disappear anytime soon, unless there's some law enforcement operation that I'm not aware of. But given that they've been in the scene for over a decade, I think they're here to stay. And I'd like to invite anyone who's researching QBot to contact us. We're happy to work with anyone who's doing research into QBot as well. And thanks for your time.